Of Arms and Men, A History of War, Weapons, and Aggression by Robert L. O'Connell. Chapter 3. Genesis. Organized warfare was part of nature long before man arrived on the scene. The coordinated rapacity and obvious political intent with which certain of the social insects conduct aggression demonstrate that, behaviorally, there is nothing uniquely human about joining an army or fighting as part of it. Whether it be meeting engagements between legions of specialized warriors or the elaborate defenses of nests to avoid enslavement, most functional aspects of human warfare are accurately reflected in the miniature depredations of a creature such as Echiton burchelli. Yet the key difference has to do with motivation. Driver ants wage war because their genes demand that they wage war. Man, on the other hand, invented his version of the phenomenon. It is a cultural instrument, a product of his imagination. This is why, as Quincy Wright recognized 40 years ago, the study of animal aggression and primitive human conflict can be taken only so far in the explanation of conscious, organized warfare. They are essentially static, while war is dynamic, invented for a specific purpose and changing with that purpose. To understand its true nature, we must follow this path and trace its development. The best estimate is that war, true war, began somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago, although it could have been much earlier, not as an aberration of the human psyche, but as the culmination of a revolutionary change in man's economic and social life. Prior to this transitional period, man had been a nomad, going where the game went. However, as early as 20,000 years ago, and for reasons still unclear, scattered groups began settling down and foraging more intensively for a broader array of smaller foods. Shelter and possessions no longer had to be portable, but could become more substantial and elaborate. Food was stored. There is evidence of social and political differentiation. Somewhat later, other groups began making the transition from hunters to herdsmen. For them, mobility probably remained central, but it was men who decided when and in what direction. Control, however, implied ownership. Thus, flocks became property, objects of value to be protected. In both cases, the implications for human relations and ultimately politics were enormous, for this was the way of the future. Yet the process apparently took place in fits and starts. There is evidence of several complex foraging communities which evolved, collapsed, and disappeared. For the food they stored was essentially meat, easily spoiled. In the end, it seems these cultures simply crashed through this unstable resource base. But it is possible, though there is no specific evidence, that violence was involved. For the keys to societal conflict, property, and politics were in place, albeit in a rudimentary form. True war probably required a more robust economic engine. The roots of agriculture appear to go back 13 or 14,000 years to a few Mid-Eastern cultures, the Natufians were archetypes, that harvested abundant and storable wild grains. Gradually, over 3,000 or 4,000 years, planting and cultivating took hold. As techniques improved, fertile, well-watered land, especially, began to produce regular and substantial surpluses. By degrees, a nexus of property grew up around the agricultural community. Wealth accumulated, and upon it grew not only civilization, but covetousness and the will to power. Jacob Bronowski has created a logical scenario for war's genesis. He argues persuasively that organized theft lies at the root of true warfare. Thus, it may have begun when nomads, pastoralists, or possibly advanced hunter-gatherers, having learned to steal from each other, descended on the fertile valleys and oases of the agriculturalist to rob his surpluses. Women and revenge, the traditional motivators, presumably still played a role in these depredations. But it was this new factor, property, which provided the impetus that had been missing previously. Although this dynamic, the nomadic outlander periodically sweeping down upon the sedentary agrarian, would remain a major theme in the history of aggression until at least the time of Genghis Khan, It was the agriculturalist response that would provide the major substance for our warlike past. Having suffered at the hands of the interloper, agrarian communities gradually learned to defend themselves. In doing so, they discovered that their more efficient economic systems imparted certain advantages in terms of time and available resources to be expended on martial activities. Similarly, it must soon have become apparent that a capable defense against nomadic marauders might be turned against their fellow plant growers in order to obtain better land, women, possessions, or even political dominion. Archaeologically in the Middle East, these changes are registered in two ways: the appearance of weapons, such as the mace, and later the battle axe, which were clearly optimized for combat, not hunting, and the introduction of massive encircling walls and fortifications around centers of population. In the latter case, the mid-1950s discovery and subsequent excavation of the massive stoneworks at Jericho demonstrated that such measures were undertaken considerably earlier, circa 7000 BC, and were technically a good deal more advanced than anyone had hitherto suspected. Moreover, their size, up to 7 meters tall, and sophistication, a large moat 9 meters wide and 3 meters deep, had been scooped out of the rock at the foot of the wall, implied equally potent means of attack. This precocity is symptomatic of the entire epoch of war up until the invention of gunpowder. While it is not exactly accurate to say that military systems emerged full-blown at the dawn of history, a remarkable amount was finalized very early, with the details being worked out, forgotten, and periodically rediscovered over a span of 5,000 years. The era began, however, with one great innovation, and that was metal. For reaping grain, slicing up carcasses, or trimming skins, stone tools served very well. Yet in combat, the wielder of metallic weapons had a tremendous advantage over adversaries whose stone-based arms were all too prone to shatter at a critical moment. Moreover, the toughness and ductility of metal made it possible to extend the length of the dagger to produce, by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, a true sword, an instrument whose reach, maneuverability, and capacity to inflict both slash and puncture wounds rendered it practically ideal for the kind of close-in combat which would become the specialty of the warrior class. To be efficient, however, swords required a metal harder and stronger than the copper that was smelted initially. Here, again, the progress of metallurgy serves to illustrate the point about precocity. Very rapidly, probably by 3500 BC, certain groups in the Middle East had learned how to alloy copper with tin to produce bronze, a substance which not only could be cast into complex forms, but after cold working, produced weapons of sufficient tensile strength and hardness to rival those of iron for certain uses until Roman times, when tempering came to be understood. Yet it is worth noting that iron, too, was used very early, Anatolian armorers having experimented with ferrous blades at least as far back as 2500 BC. Clearly, the major limitation on early metallurgy was less a matter of technology than availability. Deposits of tin, in particular, were not only scarce and capriciously scattered in this part of the world, but relatively difficult to extract. Under the circumstances, it was practically inevitable that the bulk of what metal there was would be channeled into weaponry, and that governmental structures would expand, in part, to control its acquisition and distribution. For at this level, the relationship between metallurgy, weaponry, and politics is intimate and self-reinforcing. Hence, the superior cutting and penetrating qualities of metal called forth in a defensive reciprocal in metal and metal-reinforced helmets, torso protection, and shields, objects destined to become virtual prerequisites of honorific combat for thousands of years. Yet the influence of metal was hardly limited to the simulation of new weapons. Metal points and socketed heads greatly increased the lethality of holdovers from an earlier era, the spear, the axe, and the bow. In the latter case, especially, metal-tipped arrows, propelled by bows rendered much more powerful through composite construction, combined to produce a weapon that not only was vastly improved in range and penetration, but necessitated further metallic protection. This was characteristic. The need for metal fed upon itself. Yet the advantages of metal-armed troops in terms of their ability to coerce were too clear to ignore. Moreover, the organization necessary to obtain such armaments also served to reinforce their effectiveness. As Stanislav Andreski notes, it is well known that coercion, like any mass-oriented activity, benefits from economies of scale. Hence, it is a great deal easier for a force of 1,000 to control a population of 100,000 than it is for one man to control 100. As armies grew, therefore, so did the potential for enforcing social discipline and eventually the capacity to dominate much larger populations. Similarly, the evolution of internal control, the maintenance of order and discipline within a military force, not only improved fighting efficiency, but exerted a significant influence on the emerging body politic. Hierarchies, particularly those based on multiples of 10, so suited for military command structures, naturally extended themselves to the ordering of life in general. So much so that the pyramids seem at times less monuments than giant organization charts. Yet for all this emphasis on the emerging power of groups and organizations, it is important to remember that war is still based on the life and death of the individual. Moreover, just as pyramids reach a pinnacle, so political structures were generally capped by one man with more to win or lose than any other. Hence, individual combat would remain a persistent and important theme in warfare throughout the period under study. The idea of warfare as the prime motivating force and major preoccupation of emerging urban societies must strike some as entirely overdrawn. Generally, the appearance of civilization is perceived as having broadened and enriched life, not simply militarized it. Also, it can be said that such an approach is unidimensional in that it ignores significant variations in societal evolution, along with a host of other causal factors such as religion and kinship. If the matter is looked at from our own historical perspective, a vantage point largely devoid, at least in the industrialized world, of daily hunger and internecine violence, all of this must be conceded. The picture is a distorted one. Yet when we see through the eyes of the participants, this seems much less true. The image which emerges from monuments, inscriptions, and the writings of contemporaries is that of a dangerous world where attack could come from any quarter and only the militarily strong survived. In such an environment, the successful society was, by definition, the society successful at waging war. For example, although the Greek city-state of the 5th century BC is remembered today chiefly for the magnificence of its cultural achievements, it is more likely that it was respected by contemporaries primarily for the deadly efficiency of its heavy infantry and naval squadrons. Moreover, there is reason to believe the Greeks saw themselves in much the same light. Lest this seem exaggerated, it is instructive to consider that the three greatest Greek historians, the three greatest of antiquity for that matter, Herodotus, Thucydides, and Polybius, all chose major wars as the centerpieces of their works. Nor were they alone. Practically every history preserved from this period, and later the Middle Ages, concerns itself with war and conquest. Quite simply, these were seen as the chief events of the day and the ones thought most worthy of recording. Other aspects of culture were similarly, though perhaps less uniformly, infused with the martial spirit. In many cases, the very gods were warlike, fighting among themselves in titanic struggles which defined the state of the art in bellicosity. These and other less exalted examples of heroism often functioned as a sort of cultural reservoir, providing a pool of available stories and events suitable for graphic representation and linguistic embellishment. In particular, the orally composed epic poems, which form the basis for so many national literatures, are repositories for such tales, startling the modern reader with their gory heroics and unabashed celebration of homicide and the warrior ethic. This is significant since it can be argued that monuments, inscriptions, and even histories were generally commissioned by the very parties doing the fighting, and were therefore indicative of only a small segment of society. Yet epics such as the Iliad or the Chanson de Roland were not mandated. They arose as a form of mass entertainment and were necessarily reflections of the popular consciousness. Judging by the content, it was far from pacific. It may be that men were intrinsically no more violent than they are today. Yet their acceptance, even celebration, of force as the final arbiters in human affairs is striking. Until law took hold of men's minds, might literally meant right. In intersocietal terms, this spelled endless warfare. Of course, there were numerous variations. Some states were obviously more aggressive than others. The frequency of wars for all seems to have been affected by long-term climatic and demographic trends. Bribery and diplomacy often acted as surrogates for actual combat. But in the last analysis, it remains true that until at least the commercial revolution of the 17th century AD, dominant states and empires achieved that status ultimately through an ability to wage war. An awareness of the importance of warfare during the period under consideration is critical to the study of armaments. Lacking this, it is impossible to appreciate the significance of the fact that weapons were not relentlessly improved over time by societies ambitious for power and conquest. Such forbearance was not without exception. There is certainly evidence to show at least a sporadic awareness that better weapons could provide a decisive margin of superiority in battle, and occasionally, in a time of crisis, this did lead to fundamental improvements. Also, it does seem that politically ambitious states were, in fact, some were more innovative than their more passive counterparts. Yet even in these cases, which are rare, the momentum was never sustained, and in fact novel arms frequently fell into disuse. Thus, weapons development until at least the mid-19th century AD is best described as cyclical rather than linear. To a remarkable degree, the same basic variables continued to reassert themselves, though not necessarily in the same combinations. This is not because men didn't care about weapons, quite the contrary. They revered them. Nor was it necessarily due to a dearth of technology, though the means available were often very primitive. Rather, the key to stability seems to lie more in the fact that arms were so bound up with ritual and culture, not just biology and tradition, but economic and political reality, that fundamental changes often implied a restructuring of society itself. To see how and why this was true requires that we take up the historical record and examine in a roughly chronological order the manner in which it revealed itself. Yet, such a trek through time poses a number of immediate difficulties. A subject of this magnitude, pursued for so long by so many, implies a journey far beyond the resources of the present study. In our case, only through ruthlessly selecting our stopping points will it be possible to descend to the level of detail necessary to show why it was that certain cultures came to fight and bear arms as they did. The key then becomes picking the military entities which were truly significant to the development of war and weaponry. This must be an arbitrary process. The reasoning behind the choices made here is complex and will gradually become apparent in the narrative. Yet one guiding criterion should be stipulated at the outset. Modern weaponry is a derivative of Western culture and civilization. Thus, while our tour through history will not exclude non-Occidental cultures entirely, it will be highly skewed in the direction of the West. No doubt much important military history will be missed, but so was it missed by those who brought our armaments to their present level of destructiveness. The earliest organized military forces for which hard evidence is available are those of Mesopotamia, specifically the cluster of city-states Ur, Kish, Lagash, Erech, Supurak, Larsa, and Umma, collectively known as Sumer. This is a purely generic term, though. The Sumerian communities never willingly formed anything that resembled a single political unit, but fell instead into a pattern of constant intramural warfare, in many ways similar to that which would prevail in ancient Greece and on the Italian peninsula during the Renaissance. As best can be reconstructed, they began as outlanders, coming down out of Persia and settling in lower Mesopotamia sometime during the 4th millennium. Here, they built their cities out of brick made from the abundant mud of the Tigris and the Euphrates and kept cuneiform records inscribed in the same substance. Of these, the most famous relate to a fragmentary epic cycle surrounding the life of Gilgamesh of Erech, an actual person, but also quite literally the first hero in written literature and a model for those who would follow. From a military perspective, the Gilgamesh epic is particularly interesting in the manner in which it relates to Sumerian fighting forces and in its remarkable foreshadowing of the Iliad's effect on the development of Greek heavy infantry. For at the core of the matter is a singular contradiction. Gilgamesh was an individual combatant and his countrymen were not. armed with a battle axe, surnamed Might of Heroism, the first of a long line of titled weapons, and a coat of mail, probably scaled with bronze, but not a bow. He was obviously oriented toward close combat. So were his retainers, though they seem to have relied on the spear. Yet perhaps more suggestive than armament was Gilgamesh's relationship to his men. Clearly, this was not one of blind obedience. Quite the contrary. When Gilgamesh plans to fight the rulers of Kish over water rights, he must put the question before an assembly of warriors, which immediately rejects the idea and only later reconsiders. If Gilgamesh ruled Erech, he did so with the consent of the governed. This takes on particular significance in light of a remarkable artifact, a limestone victory monument dated 2500 BC, the Stele of Vultures. Here the basic dichotomy between the individual warrior and group combatants is illustrated in the most startling way. The Stele of Vultures depicts Eanat of Lagash leading his troops into battle, the hero at the head of his army. Yet the infantry behind him is extraordinary indeed. Packed shoulder to shoulder, advancing behind a barrier of locked rectangular shields reinforced with bronze discs, and presenting a hedgehog of spearheads protruding from several rows back. This mass constitutes a full-fledged phalanx. This is an important distinction, since there is a decided tendency to overlook or discount the significance of this Sumerian development. This is not surprising. It is incredibly out of context, coming almost 2,000 years before the advanced Greeks took up the formation. Moreover, rather than being the product of sustained technical evolution, it appears to have burst virtually full-blown upon the scene. Why this is so is suggested by the behavior of Gilgamesh's men. They are clearly people with a stake in society, the very types necessary for a style of warfare which demands that the participants both fight at close range and face danger in cooperative fashion. Such qualities are impossible to bring out in any but highly motivated troops. Therefore, although the phalanx was clearly an innovation in the technical sense, it is perhaps better thought of as a sort of limited military option, available for those with the right kind of government, but otherwise unusable. This type of absolute constraint, whether politically, economically, or sociologically based, would appear to have been a significant factor in the diffusion and development of weapons technologies up to modern times. The apparent tension in Sumer between the individualized warrior and the phalanx also had political implications. It is interesting that the Stele of Vultures depicts phalangites and the individual warrior as similarly dressed and protected. While this obviously has something to do with both being specialized for close combat, it is also true that possessing and wearing appropriate regalia was a prime determinant of social status in numerous traditional societies. Thus, the phalangites' adoption of aristocratic arms, a phenomenon which would be repeated in ancient Greece, not only reflects the community's growing ability to accumulate metal, but implies an act of social mobility. Despite the importance of political factors, these preferences also appear to draw on deeper roots. Thus, the confrontational style of Sumerian warfare seems to find its analog in the Pleistocene hunt. In both cases, the greatest rewards and dangers were to be found at close range, where the virtues of courage and cooperation were most severely tested. It was natural, therefore, that the weapons appropriate for fighting at such distances, the spear, the sword, the axe, and the dagger, tended to take on the prestige associated with physical bravery. But it was more than just a matter of status and weapons. The manifest lethality of the Sumerian phalanx and its successors indicated that the outlook of the hunt, with its casual ruthlessness and willingness to kill without mercy, had now become imprinted on warfare, allowing men to commit acts of mass violence unprecedented except in the broken bodies of a herd of mastodons run off a cliff. It was here that men learned to kill wantonly, and it was this terrible capacity which they turned on themselves when they transferred it to warfare. Yet it also seems that the influence of the hunt was balanced and somewhat mitigated by the tradition of intraspecific aggression, especially in the perpetuation of single combat. There were, of course, pragmatic and political reasons. but the prominence of individualized fighting in so many divergent cultures indicates a deeper motivation. Apparently, something remained to remind antagonists that males of the same species most naturally settle disputes in pairs. On the other hand, it is obvious but still worth reiterating that women were excluded from Sumerian and, until very recently, virtually all subsequent forms of organized combat, sieges and wars with genocidal overtones being special exceptions. In this regard, it would appear that, rather than serving as the equivalent of the hunt, an activity in which female predators frequently participate, warfare preserved the intra-specific role of the female as prize and object of combat. If nothing else, this helps to account for the aura of sexuality which was hung about war and weapons throughout history, serving both as a thematic equipoise to its ruthlessness and an indication of the complexity of the subject and motives behind it. But if these undercurrents are important clues to help us understand why war developed as it did, the phenomenon remains basically about economics and politics. And on these grounds, the Sumerians were shortly to be superseded by a new type of state with a different style of warfare. The phalanx and the endless quarrels between small entities would be replaced by empire, absolute rule, and the bow. His name was Sargon, and he began life around 2300 BC, the illegitimate son, legend has it, of a Semite girl who abandoned him, Moses-like, in a cradle of reeds. He was, however, fished out of the Euphrates and grew up among the Sumerians, rising quickly, apparently on raw talent, to the important position of royal cupbearer to Ur-Zababa of Kish. But when the ambitious Lugal-Zaggisi of Umma dethroned and perhaps killed Sargon's patron, he took matters into his own hands, staging a successful surprise attack against Lugal-Zaggisi's capital, Erech, and later defeating the remnants of his troops in 2 pitched battles. The ancient home of Gilgamesh had fallen. Lugal-Zaggisi was led away in chains, and Sargon was launched on a military career that would lead to victory in, according to his own count, 34 major battles and the establishment of a domain that would stretch eventually from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Not only did he subdue all of Sumer, but under his leadership, armies from the Mesopotamian plains, for the first time, sought to take and hold the surrounding highlands, thus reversing a centuries-old pattern of conquest. This campaign is of particular interest militarily, since it has been cited by Richard Humble and others as accounting for the disappearance of the Sumerian phalanx. While it is certainly true that close infantry formations are nearly impossible to maintain in hilly, broken terrain, it is also a fact that Sargon and his empire had removed the political foundation of the phalanx. Though the Sumerian kings had never been above lording their power over their weaker rivals, Sargon had created something else, a new type of dominion which took much fuller advantage of the power latent in military organizations. He was the architect of the world's first predatory transnational tyranny, a political form remarkable for its persistence and steadfast in its reliance on absolute rule, rigid hierarchies, and above all, force as the major mechanism of expansion and cohesion. Such a societal structure necessarily influenced the evolution of its military instrumentalities. At the core, Sargon's Akkadian empire consisted of a small Semitic warrior class living off the labor of a few artisans and an ethnically heterogeneous mass of peasants. Because the latter group had no more than a marginal loyalty to the state, it is logical to assume that they lacked the aggressiveness and steadfastness to fight at close range. Indeed, as Stanislav Andreski notes, the proverbial passivity of the peasantry is largely responsible for the despotic penchant for foreign mercenaries. Yet in the ancient world, such troops were notoriously fickle and expensive, while economies of scale continued to prompt tyrannies of this nature to field very large peasant-based armies. Under the circumstances, a heavy reliance on the bow was practically inevitable, since it provided meaningful lethality without necessitating hand-to-hand combat. While physical evidence is slim, The existence of at least 2 Akkadian fragments depicting the use of the composite bow, the first such representation, has led Yigail Yadin and others to hypothesize that this new weapon, its power magnified by the careful lamination of bone, keratin, and sinew to a wooden core, provided the margin of superiority over the Sumerians. Yet in actual tactical terms, it is probable that the peasant archers were merely expected to keep up a fairly steady stream of arrows. In this sort of army, the decisive maneuver element was composed of those with the most at stake, the ruler and his retainers, who were generally armed for close combat, though the bow was often carried too. Also, it would be surprising if the Akkadian nobility did not ride into battle on chariots similar to the 4-wheeled onager-drawn vehicles of the Sumerians. This was a weapon peculiarly suited to, even archetypical of, this kind of warfare. Most sources agree it was essentially worthless as an engine of destruction. Yet as an instrument of intimidation, its impact was sufficient to win it a stable place in the Eurasian hero-oriented army until at least the time of Alexander. For the speed and power implied in this multi-equine vehicle served as a reliable means of terrorizing the weakly motivated, fulfilling the traditional role of bluff in intra-specific combat. Meanwhile, it further reinforced the heroic warrior's image of himself as far more valuable in combat than lesser men. Yet lesser men were not really the object. In most armies, the chariot evolved basically to fight other chariots, or at least to bring heroes into contact so they could duel on foot. Here was the key to this kind of combat: find and kill the leadership. Thus, military historians miss the point when they provide detailed tactical descriptions of such actions, imputing motives which did not exist and labeling as maneuver what really only amounted to crazed looting. Such engagements turned on one encounter only: the melee around the headmen. Should the king and his prime retainers fall, the battle was lost. This exposes the weakness of the entire system. It was powerful and intimidating, but utterly brittle and vulnerable to decapitation. Great empires could and did melt away in an afternoon. Thus, after generations of expansion and conquest, Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, had only to meet one defeat, circa 2230 BC, before the barbarous mountain dwellers to the east, the Gutians, and the Akkadian Empire became no more than a pale memory in the minds of a Sumerian poet centuries later. In not 5 days, in not 10 days, the herald could not proceed on his journey. The sea rider could not sail to his boat. Brigands dwelt on the roads. The doors of the gates of the land turned to clay. Almost 900 years would pass before history gave birth to an imperial beast with an appetite of the same magnitude. The history of Assyria is the history of war. Thus, A.T. Olmsted notes that from 890 to 640 BC, the great age of Assyrian imperialism, the record listed wars for 180 of the 250 years. More than any other, this state epitomized the character of the transnational tyranny: ruthless, endlessly aggressive, and hated by practically all with whom they came into contact. The Assyrians built one of the great empires of all time. A dominion welded together by an administrative structure of unprecedented dynamism and fed by an army remarkable for its versatility, inventiveness, and efficiency. The Assyrian Empire was destined to survive for some 7 centuries. Yet in the end, it would meet the same shattering fate as its Akkadian predecessor. Though longtime residents of Upper Mesopotamia, the Assyrians were slow to assert themselves. Until about 1360 BC, they remained the vassals of the kingdom of Mitanni, which at its height straddled the upper reaches of the Tigris and the Euphrates. A combination of Hittite pressure and internal dissension severely weakened the Mitanni, allowing Ashurbanipal, the first of the great Assyrian warrior kings, to take the offensive against his former masters, beginning an up and down succession of wars and conquests destined to claim as victims all of Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, and finally Egypt. Assyrian history was not without its reverses, and more than once the empire shrank practically to the gates of Nineveh, but always it would reassert itself. To a great degree, this resilience was based on an army which remained by and large much better organized and equipped than those which resisted it. Built on multiples of a basic tactical unit of 10, there are indications that discipline and control within the force were of a distinctly higher order than anything that had come before. Moreover, the Assyrians' attitude toward weaponry, rather than being traditional, was experimental. Indeed, there is evidence that this was a conscious policy pursued with considerable energy, if somewhat sporadically. Thus, Assyria stands as a major exception to the tranquil course of weapons development and a prime example of the congruence between arms innovation and political veracity. At the center of the Assyrian arsenal was the bow, an exceedingly powerful composite weapon with its ends characteristically curled forward like the bill of a duck. Yet more significant than the bow's form and performance was the versatility with which it was used. As in other armies of this sort, the basic tactical unit consisted of foot archers, either employed as skirmishers or massed in groups. The Assyrians, however, departed from their rivals in the unprecedented lengths to which they went not only to protect the latter category of bowmen, but to integrate them with other capabilities. After the reign of Ashurnasirpal, from 885 to 860 BC, ranks of archers are depicted as not only screened by shield bearers and heavily armed spearmen, but themselves dressed in long coats of mail and conical helmets. Such measures were extraordinarily costly in metal, especially iron, which the Assyrians pioneered using on a large scale. Yet they achieved an important result: the stability in these formations necessary to exploit other tactical possibilities. For the Assyrian army was history's first embodiment of the principle of combined arms, capitalizing with ruthless pragmatism on all known weapons and introducing new ones when the opportunity presented itself. Not unexpectedly, the chariot, now a two-wheeled vehicle made heavier and more stable during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III from 747 to 727 BC, retained a prominent place as a mobile platform for nobles armed for close combat but relying on the bow. More significant, though, was the introduction, sometimes around 875 BC, likely in emulation of the nomad or possible the Sumerians, of troops actually mounted on horseback. Faster than the chariot and incomparably more agile in rough terrain, mounted troops were an immediate success. Indeed, the Assyrian grafting of archer to horse not only interjected a vital element of tactical flexibility, but in fact constituted a first cut at what would become to be the deadliest weapon combination prior to the introduction of firearms. Yet there was one catch. Carvings indicate that the Assyrians never learned to ride very well, certainly not well enough to take full advantage of the man-horse synergy. For one thing, they did not have saddles. Realistically, the effective wielding of a composite bow at full gallop while riding bareback required a level of skill obtained only through a lifetime on a horse. Nomads might manage such acrobatics, but the precarious perch of Assyrian horse archers in relief provides a graphic illustration of the sociological limitations on ancient weapons innovation. You could put a man on a horse, but there was no guarantee that he would stay there. Nevertheless, mounted troops, even relative tenderfeet, proved extremely useful to the Assyrians in functions extrinsic to the central action, namely reconnaissance and pursuit. Now an enemy might be kept under observation and assaulted at exactly the moment when conditions were most propitious. Still more important, once his formations were broken, survivors could be effectively pursued and prevented from rallying, thus rendering Assyrian battle tactics considerably more deadly and decisive. Yet in a larger sense, the fundamentally predatory nature of these functions, seeking out the victim and then running him down for slaughter, provides a deeper insight into the Assyrian martial ethic, or lack of it. Here, again, the absolute ruthlessness of the hunt has come to transcend the mitigating influence inherent in intraspecific combat. This is characteristic of the Assyrian approach to war, a perspective nowhere more evident than in their devotion to siegecraft. It is probably safe to assume that up to AD 1650, more resources were invested in defensive walls than in all other public works combined. Regardless of culture or politics, virtually every urban center above hamlet size in the temperate bands of Europe, Asia, and North Africa would come to have its surrounding ramparts. So strong was the urge to fortify that imperial entities would eventually attempt to seal off entire regions in this manner. It is a singular fact that the Great Wall of China remains the sole object of human endeavor visible to the naked eye from near space orbit. Considering the means available, the magnitude of the effort expended on walls of all sorts is staggering. Yet in a violent world, they were the ultimate insurance policy, the final refuge in times of danger. While walled strongholds were never an absolute guarantee of safety, their prevalence argues convincingly for their basic soundness. Prior to 880 BC, walled towns sometimes fell to starvation, treachery, undermining, or direct assault with scaling ladders. But in general, attacking armies lacked a reliable means of reducing stone and masonry fortifications, and consequently tended to avoid them. War, then, was largely a pragmatically circumscribed activity, intraspecific inhibitions reinforced by the obduracy of brick and rubble. Armies of young males might fight in the field to their heart's content, but larger populations such as the old, women, and children remained relatively immune to their depredations. Yet the Assyrians would have none of these limitations. They descended upon safe havens, in Byron's words, like a wolf on the fold, carrying with them siege engines capable of beating down the defenses which had frustrated others. The Assyrian battering ram was one of the most ruthlessly successful weapons in history. Introduced during the reign of Ashurnasirpal, a same military wizard who fostered mounted troops, these rams appear in relief as already extraordinarily well-developed mechanisms, again illustrating the suddenness and precocity of ancient weapons innovation. Built on a six-wheeled wooden frame and covered with protective plates of leather and wicker, the engine's projecting beam was suspended in such a way that it might be directed either horizontally or upward as the tactical situation demanded. Different bits were provided for brick or conglomerate. There was even a turret bought for observation or defensive fire. Visually, the machine is startling, an acute prophecy of an early 20th century armored vehicle. Yet functionally, there was a major difference. Tanks have largely evolved to fight other tanks. Battering rams were aimed at walls. The developmental action was strictly asymmetrical, as is almost always the case with siegecraft and weapons employed primarily against civilian populations. For the battering ram implied what amounted to total war, calculated and frequently merciless. After taking one town, Ashurnasirpal bragged, "I cut off their heads. I burned them with fire. A pile of living men and of heads over against the city gate I set up. Men I impaled on stakes. The city I destroyed, devastated. I turned it into mounds and ruin heaps. The young men and maidens in the fire I burned." This sort of ritual slaughter is particularly endemic to siege warfare, though it also occurred after field actions. Clearly separate from the tactical confrontation itself, it appears more closely akin to experiences surrounding the hunt. Quite literally, the victor casts aside any feeling of common humanity and indulges in killing for its own sake. Whether this was because man lacked the inhibitory mechanisms of a natural predator, or was instead purely a cultural adjustment, is impossible to say at this point. But humankind, and particularly the Assyrians, had enlisted a terrible capacity in the cause of war and politics. A capacity that would lead one day to the death camps of Auschwitz and the targeting of urban populations with nuclear weapons. But, as always, beneath the bloodlust was the calculating hand of self-interest. Once the killing stopped, the robbery and economic exploitation began. For the instruments of conquest must have been expensive beyond all precedent. Metal-based armor protection for thousands, a massive stock of war horses to be cared for and fed, siege engines weighing in the tons to be either transported or constructed on the spot. All the innovations the Assyrians sprung on their victims translated into what must have been an order of magnitude leap in the cost of waging war. Moreover, as military specialties increased in complexity, the force structure became, by necessity, more professional. Though the national levy was still called, by the time of Sargon II, a usurper whose taste in nomenclature testifies to an acute sense of history, in about 720 BC, the corps was an actual standing army. Seen from a cost-benefit standpoint, Such a force was entirely inappropriate for a primitive economy based mostly on subsistence agriculture, unless it largely paid for itself. To maintain its own sophistication, the Assyrian military machine had to fight and keep on fighting. The enormous hauls of metal and slaves from the cities taken were the fuels which fed the economic fires of the military Leviathan. As costs rose, so did the pulse of Assyrian history, after which 745 BC comes to resemble a vortex of destruction. The sack of Damascus, the sack of Samaria, the sack of Musasir, the sack of Thebes, the sack of Susa. Each was a military victory, but also a monument to the insatiable hunger that drove the beast. Inevitably, as the empire grew beyond the limitations of its communications and administrative network, revolt spread among conquered nationalities. The Assyrians responded with characteristic harshness, going so far as deporting entire populations as a means of pacification. Yet they could not extinguish the spark of disobedience, and gradually more and more resources were consumed in putting down new conflagrations. Worse yet, the increasing difficulty of the task bears witness to the growing military capabilities of Assyria's foes. Generally, in the ancient world, geographical isolation and tradition-based weapons choice combined to foster a relatively high degree of arms asymmetry. In the case of the Assyrians, however, success over several centuries inevitably led to imitation. As metal production, especially of ferrous ores, grew, mail, helmets, and particularly iron-bladed swords became increasingly more common throughout the region. Organizations also improved, with hierarchies of 10 becoming the basis for command structures in a number of armies besides the Assyrian. Specialist troops also proliferated, and new forms of arms were consciously assimilated. Thus, Samuel, upon establishing the central kingdom of Israel, declared the chariot squadron might be set up for the first time. It must have happened again and again as the rule of symmetry silently asserted itself, and the Assyrian military advantage gradually slipped away. True enough, this took place over several centuries, and the Assyrian army continued to win battles right up to the end. Yet in the last analysis, innovation and hegemony based solely on superiority of arms proved largely self-defeating. The Assyrians raised the level of expertise within their army to the limits of technological and sociological possibility. But in doing so, they merely provided a standard to be equaled. Ashurbanipal, in 626 BC, the leadership faltered, and nothing remained to hold the empire together. All of Mesopotamia rose in revolt. Whether Arnold Toynbee is correct in assuming that depopulation was the ultimate price of militarism, Assyria, at this point, was indeed a corpse in armor. Finally, in 612 BC, surrounded by enemies, Nineveh would fall, her walls breached, no doubt, by the siege engines her rulers had so confidently introduced centuries before. "Desolate Nineveh," sneered Nahum, prophet of Yahweh, "who shall bewail her?"